Sometimes healing begins not with words, but with a glance, a step, or the quiet breath of an animal that refuses to give up. This is the story of an old man, a scarred dog, and a wild horse. Three souls, each broken in their own way, who found something worth living for in each other. If you believe in second chances, in the quiet power of loyalty and grace, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and follow along. This story may just heal a piece of your heart too. Montana, in early autumn, bore a quiet dignity. The air was crisp, scented faintly with hay and pine, and a sheet of overcast clouds stretched across the sky like a memory refusing to pass. The town of Bridger, nestled near the Beartooth Mountains, was the kind of place where time settled into the soil. The wind swept over the golden fields and rusted barns, brushing gently against the worn fences that once divided bustling farmland, now standing like forgotten sentinels. Thomas Harlan, 62, walked along the rickety edge of what used to be his neighbor's property, a now abandoned stretch of land overgrown with weeds and regret. Tall and broad-shouldered, Thomas had the sturdy build of a man who had labored most of his life with his hands. His once black hair had faded into a thick silver mane tucked beneath a canvas hat, and his denim coat, patched in places, swung against his knees as he moved. Life had marked him with both strength and sorrow. 4 years ago, his wife Marie had passed from cancer, leaving behind a house too quiet and a man too proud to admit how broken he'd become. Since her death, he'd taken to walking each morning, with Ranger his German shepherd and most faithful companion. Ranger had been a rescue, just over 5 years old now. With deep, intelligent brown eyes and a powerful, well-muscled frame, the dog carried himself like a soldier. His black and tan fur shimmered even under the gray skies, and his movements were both precise and cautious, like a sentinel always on alert. They walked in silence, as they did every morning. The wind tugged at Thomas's jacket as he adjusted his scarf, and Ranger padded ahead, with his nose close to the ground, ears twitching to every rustle in the grass. But then Ranger stopped. The dog froze mid-stride, head tilted, muscles tensed. And then came the bark sharp, commanding, filled with urgency. Thomas's head snapped up. "What is it, boy?" Ranger let out another bark and then took off, paws pounding against the uneven earth. Thomas's heart kicked as he chased after him, his boots crunching through dried grass and brittle weeds. "Ranger, slow down!" But Ranger didn't stop. He weaved through a break in the fence toward a hollow dip in the field behind the old dairy barn. It was a part of the land few dared cross anymore, left to wild overgrowth and neglect. As Thomas caught up, breath visible in the cool air, he saw what had made Ranger bark. At the base of a sloped ridge, tangled in rusted barbed wire and partially obscured by thistle and debris, was a wild Mustang. The animal was young, perhaps 5 years old, its coat a striking silver gray marred with streaks of dirt and blood. Its mane was tangled and matted, and one of its back legs was deeply caught in coils of barbed wire. Every few seconds it tried to rise, but each motion sent fresh blood seeping down its flank. Its breathing was shallow. Its large dark eyes, wild with fear and exhaustion, locked onto Thomas's. Thomas knelt down slowly. "Good God!" Ranger, unprompted, took a few cautious steps forward, then stopped. His body low, tail still, ears slightly pinned back, not aggressive, just aware. He let out a soft whine and sat. The dog didn't bark again. He simply stayed there, like a statue of loyalty, offering stillness. Thomas studied the scene. The wire must have belonged to an old fence that had fallen apart years ago, swallowed by brush and time. The horse had likely wandered in from the north woods, where wild herds still roamed, perhaps searching for food or water, and stepped into the trap. He looked back at Ranger, then at the horse. "We can't leave it like this." The Mustang flinched as Thomas took a step closer. Its leg bled freely now, and Thomas could see how the wire had bitten deep, wrapping cruelly around the tendons. Yet what struck him most was the horse's expression. It wasn't just fear. There was something pleading in its gaze, as if it hadn't given up. Not yet. Thomas knew what Marie would have said. Every creature deserves a second chance, even the stubborn ones. He crouched, keeping his voice low and even. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you. Just need to see how bad it is." He didn't try to touch the horse, he knew better. Instead, he inspected from a short distance, noting where the wire wrapped and where it dug in. The injuries were serious but not fatal. If the bleeding could be stopped and infection prevented, the horse had a chance. But time was running out. He stood and looked at Ranger. "I'll have to come back with the cutters and first aid. Stay with him, boy." Ranger's ears perked slightly. He walked to the horse and lay down a foot away, calm and unmoving. Thomas hesitated. It would take him 20 minutes to get back to the house, maybe 30 if the cold slowed him. But something in him couldn't quite pull away yet. He scanned the horizon. The clouds above thickened slightly, hinting at light snow later that afternoon. The wind had picked up, rustling the brittle weeds and carrying the scent of iron from the blood. The horse whinnied, low and hoarse. Its eyes fluttered. Ranger nudged his nose slightly forward, not touching, just being present. The moment held its breath. Thomas took off his coat and approached slowly, unrolling it, speaking gently as he laid it near the horse. Not on it, but close enough to offer some shelter from the wind. "Just until I get back. You hang in there, all right?" His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the old ache in his chest that came whenever something mattered more than he was ready to admit. He looked once more at the sight before him, a scarred Mustang trembling from pain, a steadfast dog refusing to move, and himself, an old man with nothing left to lose, except the small thread of hope this morning had brought him. Without another word, Thomas turned and began the walk back. Ranger stayed behind, and as he glanced back once over his shoulder, Thomas saw the dog lift his head toward the wind, ears perked, standing watch like a guardian of lost things. By the time Thomas returned with his toolkit slung over his shoulder and a thermos of warm water tucked beneath his arm, the sky had begun to change. The morning gray had given way to a softer light, though the clouds remained heavy above the Montana plains. The wind had calmed, but the cold still clung to the grass like a warning not yet lifted. He hurried through the broken fence line and descended back into the hollow, breath catching slightly from the brisk pace and the tight pull of age in his knees. When the brush finally gave way to the small clearing, what he saw stopped him cold for a moment. Ranger had not moved. The German shepherd remained lying beside the wounded Mustang, his body coiled in quiet vigilance. The horse, still pinned by the rusted barbed wire, looked weaker now. Its head had dropped, nostrils flaring slowly with each breath, steam curling in lazy wisps from its muzzle. But its eyes, those dark, shimmering eyes, lifted and locked onto Thomas as he stepped closer. There was no panic, only exhaustion, and something else. Trust. It hit Thomas in the chest, low and unspoken, the same way Marie's gaze once did on those long hospital nights when she said everything without uttering a word. He set down the bag beside him and knelt. "You waited," he whispered, half to the horse, half to Ranger. "Let's not waste that." Thomas unzipped the toolkit with hands steady from decades of fixing fences and old tractors. He pulled out a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, thick gloves, gauze, antiseptic spray, and an old horse blanket. He had brought it all without even thinking. His body still remembered what it was like to care for something that couldn't speak. Before he touched the wire, Thomas spoke softly, not because the horse would understand the words, but because calm had its own language. "Okay, here's the plan. We're going to do this slow, no surprises." He reached out, gloves protecting his hands, and began working on the first coil. The barbs clung like claws, rust biting into flesh and fur. With every snip, the Mustang flinched, muscles tensing, nostrils flaring, but it did not kick. Ranger let out a single soft whine and inched closer, resting his head just near the horse's shoulder, as if offering silent support. Thomas worked with the care of a man untangling time itself. He paused only once when he heard the crunch of footsteps on the distant path behind him. He turned quickly, eyes narrowing. A figure approached, a woman wrapped in a brown shearling coat. A red scarf knotted beneath her chin. She was tall, mid-50s, with weathered cheeks and dark curls tucked into a knit cap. Her gait was quick, but she moved cautiously when she spotted the scene. Her name was Caroline Fisher, a retired veterinary technician who had moved to Bridger 3 years ago to take care of her aging father. Most knew her for her kindness and practicality. She volunteered at the community center and rescued stray cats with unapologetic frequency. Her face showed the kind of quiet resilience that only came from tending wounds, both hers and others. "I saw you crossing the ridge," she said softly, stopping just short of the hollow. "Thought I'd check if everything was all right." Thomas didn't look up. Got a Mustang caught in barbed wire. Pretty bad." She took a few steps closer, eyes scanning the situation with immediate understanding. "That leg's wrapped tight. You've started treating it?" "Just cutting him free now. Got gauze, spray, but I could use a steadier hand." Without waiting for permission, Caroline removed her gloves and came to kneel beside him, pulling a small pouch from her coat. A habit she never kicked, always carried something useful. "I've got sterile saline and a roll of vet wrap. Mind if I help?" Thomas glanced sideways, surprised but grateful. "Be my guest." Ranger shifted slightly, sniffed the air around her, then settled again, tail flicking once in approval. The dog, usually suspicious of strangers, seemed to recognize something in her gentleness, perhaps, or just the absence of fear. Together, they worked. Thomas cut, Caroline cleaned. The Mustang, whom she began calling Silver under her breath, barely moved. Only its eyes flicked between them, blinking slowly as if trying to memorize their faces. "You always keep barbed wire just lying around your land?" she asked as she secured the first wrap. Thomas exhaled through his nose. "That patch isn't mine. Belonged to the Wilkins farm abandoned after '98. Fences are ghosts now." "Dangerous ghosts." They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't time. When the final wire was removed, Thomas laid the old blanket over Silver's shivering back and poured a small stream of warm water into a shallow pan, holding it beneath the horse's mouth. Silver drank. Not much, but enough. Caroline stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "He'll need rest, and antibiotics if we're lucky. Infection's the real threat now." "I don't have antibiotics." "I do. I'll bring some from the rescue shelter, but he can't stay out here. Not like this." Thomas looked over the ridge. "There's an old livestock shed behind my house. Been empty for years, but it's still standing." "You think he'll follow?" "If he's still standing tomorrow, I'll lead. Ranger will help." She nodded, and her eyes, green, tired, kind, lingered on him for a second too long. "You're not as rough around the edges as you look, Thomas Harlan." He chuckled once, a short sound that felt like the first exhale in days. "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation." They shared a moment of quiet, surrounded by the golden hush of wind and brittle weeds. Then Caroline stepped away, saying she'd be back before dusk with medicine and grain. When she was gone, Thomas sat beside the horse, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's shoulder. The dog leaned into the touch. Silver, lying there, let out a deep breath. And for the first time since Thomas had found him, the Mustang closed his eyes, not from pain, but from rest. The sky changed without warning. By mid-afternoon, what had been a heavy overcast had darkened into something far more ominous. Clouds tumbled low over the plains like slow-moving bruises, and the wind began to howl with a restlessness that stirred the dying grasses. Thomas stood at the ridge above the hollow, eyes narrowing as he watched the sky swallow the last pale streaks of light. Silver hadn't moved much since the morning. The bandages Caroline had helped apply were holding, but the Mustang was still weak, still lying low in the field, his breath shallow and body twitching from fatigue. Ranger, as always, stayed close head on paws, occasionally glancing between the sky and the horse, as though anticipating the storm himself. Thomas had seen enough Montana summers to know what was coming. Though technically still late September, summer's last fury had not quite passed. And here, in this open land with no trees to break the wind, storms rolled in like gods. He knelt beside Silver, brushed his hand gently against the horse's damp neck, and whispered, "We've got to get you through one more thing, partner." Caroline had promised to return before dark, but she wasn't back yet. Thomas didn't like the idea of leaving Silver exposed with the storm on the way. Not now, not after all this. He moved quickly, heading toward the tree line near the back of the hollow. Years ago, he had hidden an old tarp there, left over from his fencing days, when he and Marie had tried to grow a modest garden just beyond their property line. Amazingly, the tarp was still there, faded blue, stiff from sun and rain, but intact. Back at the clearing, Thomas tied one end to a bent fence post and the other to a half-fallen tree, creating a crude lean-to over Silver's body. He secured the edges with stones and a few short branches, shielding the Mustang from the worst of the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. Then he sat down beside them, knees creaking, pulling his coat tighter around him. The temperature dropped as the first gusts rolled in. Thunder groaned in the distance, slow and deep, like a beast waking from sleep. Silver flinched. Ranger stood, circled once, and pressed his body against Thomas's side before lying back down. The three of them, man, dog, horse, waited in the quiet before the storm. The first drops came light and scattered, tapping the tarp and brushing Thomas's face like nervous fingertips. Then came the wind, fierce and relentless. It yanked at the tarp, moaned through the broken brush, and set the long grass into a frantic dance. Thomas stayed still, one hand on Ranger's back, one hand resting gently against Silver's shoulder. Then came the rain. Heavy and cold, it fell in sheets, drenching the ground and turning soil to mud. But under the tarp, there was a small pocket of warmth, of stillness. Thomas could hear Silver's slow, labored breathing. Ranger's heartbeat thumped steady beside him. He exhaled and leaned back against the makeshift shelter. Sometime in the middle of the storm, he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, it was dark, true night, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that lit the sky in brief, blinding strokes. Thunder cracked like cannon fire overhead. Silver shuddered, but did not try to move. Ranger growled low once, protective, but didn't bark. In the distance, headlights approached slowly from the road. A battered old truck creaked its way over the uneven path toward the ridge. Its engine sounded like it was held together by stubbornness and baling wire, and Thomas immediately knew who it was. Caroline. The truck parked at the edge of the field, and Caroline emerged with a waterproof lantern, a small satchel, and a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her hair was damp and curling from the humidity, and her cheeks were pink with windburn, but her eyes were determined. "I brought antibiotics," she said as she reached the edge of the hollow. "And hey, barely made it through the creek flooding already." Thomas helped her down. Together, they crawled under the tarp. She unwrapped the satchel and pulled out a syringe, a small bottle, and a thermos of warm oatmeal mash for the horse. Silver flinched when she touched his flank, but did not resist. The injection was quick. The food was harder. He was too tired to eat more than a few bites, but he tried. "You did good," Caroline whispered, brushing her hand through Silver's matted mane. They sat in silence after that. The storm howled, but they didn't move. The tarp flapped violently, and water pooled at its corners, but inside that small triangle of light and breath and warmth, a kind of peace settled. "Funny," Thomas muttered after a while. "Storm like this? I used to think it meant trouble." Caroline looked at him. "And now? Now I think it's just a test of what's worth holding on to." She nodded, then leaned back against the same fallen log he did. Ranger shifted his position slightly so that his body rested between both of them. Silver's breathing slowed to a calmer rhythm. The three of them stayed that way, curled against the storm, strangers drawn together by circumstance, each scarred in their own way, but unwilling to give up on the others. By dawn, the storm had passed. The clouds broke apart into ribbons of soft lavender and gold, and light spilled across the drenched prairie. Silver was still alive, still breathing. Ranger lifted his head first, ears perked, eyes scanning the now quiet horizon. Thomas stretched slowly, aching but warm. Caroline was already awake, staring out at the pale pink sky like someone who had waited years to see it again. In that moment, Thomas didn't feel like an old man. He felt like a keeper of something fragile and worth saving. Dawn broke in streaks of pale gold, pushing back the lingering shadows of the storm. The air was still damp, the ground soft and heavy beneath Thomas's boots. Mist curled around the tall grass, like breath exhaled from the sleeping earth. Birds returned cautiously to the sky, their chirps uncertain, as if testing whether the world had truly calmed. Thomas crouched beside Silver beneath the tattered blue tarp, fingers numb as he checked the bandages from the night before. They had held through the rain, but water and mud had crusted over parts of the wire that still clung to Silver's rear leg. The storm had delayed the final cut. He'd hoped Silver would have the strength to stand by now, but the Mustang remained grounded, weak but alert. Ranger lay nearby, ears perked, eyes sharp, tail still. He hadn't slept much through the night. Every crack of thunder or distant noise had drawn his gaze. Now, with morning calm draped over them, he seemed more at ease, but still watchful. Thomas exhaled and pulled the wire cutters from his coat pocket. "All right, boy," he said quietly to Silver. "Last of it now, then we get you home." He bent forward and began snipping at the twisted metal around the leg, one barb at a time. It was painstaking work. The wire had embedded deep into the flesh, and though Silver didn't struggle, the pain was obvious in the tight twitch of his muscles and the flaring of his nostrils. Ranger rose and stepped closer, placing himself behind Thomas and the horse, facing the tree line. His head lifted slightly, his nose twitched, then he growled. It was low, a rolling thunder deep in his chest. Thomas froze. Ranger's body stiffened, hackles raised. Thomas turned his head slowly and followed the dog's gaze to the edge of the woods, about 30 yards from where they crouched. A shadow moved, then another. They emerged in silence, 3 at first, then 5, then 7. Lean, gray shapes, all muscle and hunger, paws padding over the wet ground like ghosts. A pack of wolves. The lead wolf was large, nearly black, with scarred flanks and golden eyes that locked immediately onto the trio in the clearing. Its ribs showed slightly beneath a matted coat. It hadn't eaten well in weeks. None of them had. The storm had pushed them from deeper territory, driven by desperation. Thomas's heartbeat hammered in his ears. He stood slowly, shielding Silver with his body, one hand instinctively dropping to his coat pocket. Ranger stepped forward with a snarl now, tail rigid, body positioned squarely between the wolves and the wounded Mustang. Thomas had no weapon. He never carried one on these walks. But he had something else, an old Marine-issue signal flare, kept in his coat for emergencies since Marie's passing. She used to insist on it, back when he still took long drives alone into the mountains. His fingers found it, cold, cylindrical, heavy. The lead wolf took a step forward, ears flat. Ranger barked once sharp and guttural and lunged forward just enough to make the wolves pause. But the pack didn't retreat. They circled slightly, testing, calculating. "Easy, Ranger! Hold!" Thomas whispered, his voice tight. One of the wolves darted closer, a quick test. Ranger sprang to meet it. They clashed hard, a blur of fur and snarls. Ranger bit deep into the wolf's flank, forcing it back with a yelp, but not before a set of fangs raked across his shoulder. Thomas pulled the flare from his coat, yanked the cap, and struck it against the rock at his feet. A burst of angry red flame hissed to life, spitting sparks and smoke into the wet air. He waved it above his head, shouting with every ounce of his breath, "Back! Get out!" The wolves hesitated. The red light cast wild shadows across the clearing, reflecting in their eyes like fire. Smoke twisted around the flare, and Thomas threw it toward the base of the lead wolf's feet. It landed with a sputtering hiss. The black wolf snarled and leapt backward. The rest followed in retreat, some bounding into the woods, others slinking away with cautious glances over their shoulders. Silence returned, broken only by the fading crackle of the dying flare. Thomas dropped to one knee beside Ranger. Blood was seeping from a long gash near the dog's shoulder, but he stood firm, breathing heavy, tail still up. He had not backed down. His body shook slightly, not from fear, but adrenaline. "Damn brave mutt," Thomas murmured, grabbing the gauze roll from his kit. "Let me see it." As he wrapped the wound, Silver shifted behind him. It wasn't a small movement. It was deliberate. Thomas turned just in time to see the Mustang push against the ground with his uninjured leg. His hooves scraped the dirt, muscles straining, nostrils flaring with the effort. The beast that had lain still for nearly 2 days was now rising slow, trembling, but determined. Ranger lifted his head and whined, watching. Silver stood, wobbly, head lowered, but fully upright. The horse shook once, a spray of rain and mud flying from his mane. Then, with surprising force, he kicked back with his hind legs, striking the ground and letting out a breathy, guttural snort that sounded like a war cry. One remaining wolf, lingering too close to the edge of the woods, yelped and fled. Thomas stared, stunned. Silver turned his head and looked directly at him, not with fear, with fire. Ranger let out a quiet woof, as if in agreement. Thomas stood and stepped closer. "Well, hell," he said, his voice thick. "Guess you've still got some fight in you." Silver exhaled and took one slow step forward, and then another. The morning after the attack broke crisp and cold, the air smelling of wet cedar and churned earth. Pale sunlight filtered through the thinning clouds, casting a golden shimmer over the grass still matted from rain and paw prints. The hollow bore the marks of the struggle-trampled ground, scattered wire, and blood-stained soil. But what remained was more than destruction. It was survival. Thomas stood with his hands on his hips, studying Silver as the Mustang took another shaky step forward. The horse was upright now, leaning but alert, his dark eyes still tracking every movement. Thomas knew better than to push him to walk far today. One miracle was enough. Ranger, however, wasn't doing as well. The gash across his shoulder was deeper than it had seemed in the dark. Blood had dried thick into the fur around the wound, and though the dog stood proudly beside Silver, Thomas could see the slight hitch in his front step. "Time to get you patched up, soldier," Thomas said softly, crouching to look Ranger in the eye. "You did your part." Ranger licked his nose and wagged his tail once, as if saying, "I'll live." Thomas led them slowly back toward the farmhouse. He kept one hand near Silver's mane, not holding, just present. The Mustang limped but followed, his trust hard-earned and fragile, like a thread stretched taut. Ranger walked behind them, a silent shadow, ever vigilant. Back at the ranch, Thomas opened the side gate to an old wooden barn at the edge of his property. The barn had been unused for years, cobwebs clung to rafters, and dust coated every plank. But the structure held. Marie had loved this barn. She used to dream of turning it into a horse shelter, back when they'd talked about fostering animals. Life, however, had made other plans. He cleared a space with his shovel, laying fresh straw from a bag left forgotten in the shed. Then he helped Silver inside, guiding him gently into the stall, once meant for calves. The horse hesitated, sniffed the doorframe, then stepped in. Thomas stood in the doorway, staring at the animal, now resting in the old barn Marie had once painted white with her own hands. He didn't realize his fingers had curled into fists until Ranger let out a soft whine behind him. Yeah, he muttered, blinking hard. "I'm fine." He turned to his old friend. Ranger was sitting, head tilted, favoring his wounded shoulder. Thomas led him into the mudroom of the house where the old first aid kit still sat, untouched for months. The kit had been Marie's labeled, organized, and overflowing with supplies she had insisted on keeping, just in case. Thomas washed the wound gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. Ranger didn't flinch. He just watched him, eyes steady, tail tapping now and then against the wooden floor. "You know," Thomas said quietly, "she would have liked you. Hell, you two would have ganged up on me." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory. Marie had been a veterinary nurse for over 20 years. She had met Thomas at a county fair, where he'd brought in a sick goat from his cousin's farm, and she'd patched it up without a second thought. She was tall and slim, always with her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back in a messy bun that never stayed put. Her laugh had been sharp and fast, like clinking glass, and she had a way of making both people and animals stand still and listen. She used to say, "Chua lan jong vat kung la chua lan trai tim min." Thomas never understood what that meant, until now. After bandaging Ranger, he brought out an old blanket from the hall closet, one Marie had used for her rescue cats. It still smelled faintly of lavender and hay. He spread it in the corner of the living room, where the sun hit just right, and patted it. Ranger lay down slowly, his body finally giving in to rest. With his dog safe and the storm past, Thomas returned to the barn, tools and salves in hand. Silver lifted his head at the sound of the door creaking open. His eyes still watched everything, guarded but no longer panicked. Thomas approached slowly, crouching beside the horse and beginning to clean the remaining cuts around the leg. They were raw but no longer bleeding. He worked in silence, his hands familiar with the rhythm of care. The barn was warm with the scent of straw and old wood, and the quiet filled the space like a lullaby. At some point, he began to hum, an old folk tune Marie used to hum while she cleaned stalls or folded laundry. He didn't realize it until Silver shifted and lowered his head beside him, one ear flicking toward the sound. Thomas chuckled under his breath. "Well, look at you." He finished treating the wound and stood, stretching his back with a groan. Outside, the wind had stilled completely. It was one of those rare Montana moments where the land held its breath after days of tension. As he leaned against the stall door, Thomas pulled a photograph from his wallet. It was old and creased, edges worn from years of being carried too close to the heart. It showed Marie standing outside the barn, covered in paint, laughing at something just out of frame. There was hay in her hair and light in her eyes. He looked at it for a long time. "She would have known what to do right away," he said aloud. "Wouldn't even have hesitated." Silver neighed softly, as if in agreement. Thomas put the photo back and walked to the edge of the barn, where Ranger now lay on the porch, awake and watching. Their eyes met. It wasn't just companionship anymore. It was understanding. Back inside the barn, Silver dozed with his head lowered. Ranger lay beside him, their bodies forming a silent crescent in the straw. Two creatures from different worlds, breathing in rhythm, their eyes occasionally meeting, not in fear, not even in curiosity, but in a kind of wordless loyalty. No bark, no neigh, no sound at all, just presence. And for Thomas, that was enough. The days that followed moved like pages turning in a quiet book. The storm had passed, the wolves had gone, and for the first time in a long while, the ranch seemed to breathe again. The air was crisp but kinder, carrying with it the scent of pine and cracked leaves. The Montana sky stretched wide, as if offering space for healing. Thomas rose early as always, but now his mornings were different. Instead of solitude, he found a small, deliberate rhythm in the company of two silent companions, one with a coat like ash and eyes like embers, and the other with steady paws and a soldier's soul. Silver. He hadn't meant to name the horse, not at first. Names were promises, and promises were heavy. But one morning, as the sun struck the Mustang's side just right, revealing the pale shimmer beneath the dust and scars, the words slipped from Thomas's mouth before he could stop it. "You've got silver in you, don't you?" he'd said softly, brushing a hand down the horse's shoulder. "Not just in your coat, in your bones." The horse blinked slowly, accepting the name like it had always been his. And just like that, Silver became more than a stray. He became someone. The transformation was slow but visible. Each day Silver gained strength. His gait steadied, his appetite returned, and his eyes, once hollow with fear, began to carry curiosity. Ranger never strayed far from his side. They moved together in quiet unison, like two halves of an old song finally remembered. Thomas would watch them from the porch, coffee in hand, as the dog and horse walked the edge of the property at dusk. Ranger would pause and sniff the wind. Silver would lower his head to nuzzle the dry earth. Then they'd stand still, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky melt from gold to violet. It was in those moments that Thomas began to feel something strange. Peace. It wasn't loud or sudden. It crept in like morning fog, quiet, soft, but undeniable. One afternoon, as Thomas swept the barn and refilled the hay, he heard the sound of a truck engine crunching up the gravel drive. He stepped outside, brushing hay from his sleeves, just as Caroline Fisher climbed down from her aging red pickup. She wore jeans tucked into mud-caked boots, her dark curly hair braided down one side, and a green windbreaker zipped against the chill. She carried a canvas tote in one hand and a lidded thermos in the other. "Brought more feed," she said, walking up with her usual no-nonsense tone. "And something for your shoulder. If you haven't iced it yet, you're an idiot." Thomas smirked. "Morning to you too, Caroline." She raised a brow. "Don't make me regret showing up." Caroline had been stopping by every other day since the storm, not just for Silver, though she always brought something for him. It was in the way she lingered, the way she watched Ranger, or the way she filled silences like someone who had grown tired of empty rooms. "You named him yet?" she asked, glancing at the pasture. Thomas nodded toward the horse. "Silver." Caroline tilted her head, considering it. "That fits." "He's earned it," Thomas said quietly. Later that evening, after she'd left and the sun had begun its long descent, Thomas stood by the barn watching Silver nudge his way across the field, with Ranger trotting beside him. The dog's wound had healed into a clean scar, and he no longer favored the leg. The two moved like they were tethered by something invisible, something that didn't need explaining. That night, as Thomas sat on the porch with an old quilt draped over his knees, he wrote in the leather-bound notebook Marie had once kept for garden plans and animal notes. He hadn't opened it since she passed. The pages still smelled faintly of chamomile and dust. He flipped to a clean sheet and began to write. Not anything poetic or grand, just what he saw. October 2nd. Name the horse today. Silver. Suits him. Ranger likes him more than he's liked most people. Maybe that means something. Maybe it doesn't. He paused, then added, "I think we're becoming a strange little family." He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. Ranger lay at his feet. Silver stood not far from the fence, ears flicking in the breeze, silhouetted by moonlight. The barn door creaked gently in the wind. The world felt small, but full. And Thomas, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like the last one left behind. The evening fell softly over the ranch, casting long blue shadows that slid across the fields like gentle ghosts. The wind was still, and the stars began to blink one by one above the silhouette of the barn. It was a quiet night, the kind that didn't ask for music or conversation, just stillness, just breath. Thomas sat alone at the old kitchen table, a single lamp glowing beside him, casting a circle of warm amber onto the wood. Before him lay a thick stack of unused stationery, yellowed a little with age tied in twine Marie had once kept in the top drawer beside the extra stamps and broken pencils. His pen hovered for a moment. Then, without ceremony, he pressed its tip to the page. He began. Marie, I'm not writing this because I expect it to go anywhere. Lord knows the mailbox don't run to heaven. But there are things I need to say out loud again. Maybe to you, maybe to myself. He paused, the ink glistening as it dried. Outside the window, he could see the outline of the barn. A faint shape moved within Silver, now strong enough to stand at night, shifting to lean against the wooden rail. Ranger lay just outside the barn door, his head between his front paws, eyes half-lidded, but always watching. You wouldn't believe what I've been through this past week. Or maybe you would. You always had a sense for broken things, people, animals, engines. Me. He leaned back slightly, gaze distant. I found him, or he found me. Silver. He's the kind of wild that wears pain in his bones. Got caught up in rusted wire, out near the Wilkins field. Should have died. Might have, if not for Ranger. He looked toward the hallway, where the dog's bed lay empty, abandoned in favor of sleeping near the barn. Ranger wouldn't leave him, just sat there with him through the cold and the storm. You'd have said he was guarding something sacred, and maybe he was. Hell, he took on a pack of wolves for that horse. Got himself torn up good. I patched him with the kit you left behind. It still smelled like you. Thomas swallowed hard. His hand trembled slightly, but he kept writing. We stayed under a tarp during the worst of the rain. Me, the dog, the Mustang. And I swear for a moment, it was like time just stopped. No grief, no noise, just breath and heartbeat. I think it was the first time since you passed that I didn't feel alone. He set the pen down for a moment, running a thumb along the edge of the page. Then he picked it up again. I named him Silver. You would have liked him. He's proud but not mean. He's got fight in him, but he don't lash out, just stands his ground. I think he reminds me of you. Thomas let out a faint laugh through his nose. Outside, a coyote howled once, distant and fading. Caroline's been coming by. You remember her tall gal with the sharp mouth and gentle hands. Retired vet tech. Moved here after her dad passed. I think she's still figuring out how to be alone, same as me. She's brought feed, wrapped wounds. She doesn't ask for much, but she doesn't miss a thing. Ranger likes her. That says more than anything. His hand slowed. I still miss you. That hasn't changed, but it's different now. It's quieter. Like the grief has folded itself into a corner of my chest, not gone, but gentler. And these two, Ranger and Silver, they've filled up some of the silence you left behind. Not all of it. No one could. But some. He stopped to breathe, long and deep. I wish you could see them now. Ranger, watching over Silver like a guardian angel with teeth. Silver, finally walking the pasture on his own. And me, writing to you with hands that still remember your touch. Thomas set the pen down. He didn't cry, not the way he used to. Bent over the sink, hiding from the dog. But the tears came, slow, warm, not bitter, not anymore. He folded the letter, placed it gently inside an old mason jar, and carried it outside. The night air was crisp, touched with pine and the faint sweetness of hay. Stars glistened like frost in the heavens. He walked across the grass barefoot, feeling the earth cold and honest beneath him. At the edge of the field, where Marie had planted wildflowers long ago, he knelt and buried the jar between two stones. Not as a grave, as a promise. He looked up toward the barn. Inside, Silver turned his head, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Ranger stood beside him, tail wagging once, just enough to say, I see you. Thomas smiled. We're okay, he whispered to the sky. We're all okay now. and for the first time in years, he believed it. The town of Bridger came alive in early October, dressed in colors that seemed painted by the hand of something older than memory. The leaves had turned into flames, amber, crimson, gold, and the wind carried the scent of roasted corn, pumpkin pie, and hay bales freshly laid out in the square. Flags flapped from porch railings. Children ran with sticky caramel apples in hand, their laughter echoing between the booths lined with jams, quilts, and baked goods. It was the annual autumn fair, and for the first time in years, Thomas Harlan had come into town for more than just feed and fencing wire. He stood at the edge of the festival grounds in a clean denim jacket, the sleeves a bit too long, a dark brown Stetson shading his eyes. Ranger walked calmly beside him, his coat groomed and glossy, the faint scar across his shoulder barely noticeable unless you knew to look. His gait was strong again, regal, and just a few paces behind, Silver followed. No rope, no halter, just choice. The Mustang's coat shimmered beneath the morning sun, his mane now brushed out, though still wild in spirit. Every step was measured and proud, a creature once claimed by wire and pain, now walking through the heart of a human world without fear. People turned, first a few, then more. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed. An older man paused mid-conversation, blinking in disbelief. "That's the horse from the valley," someone whispered. "Is that Thomas Harlan's dog?" A young woman in a flannel dress and cowboy boots approached cautiously. She was in her late 20s, freckled, with short auburn curls and a camera slung over her shoulder. Her name was Emma Thorne, a local photographer who ran the town's tiny newsletter and spent most of her time capturing Bridger's forgotten beauty. She lifted her camera slightly. "Mr. Harlan, may I?" Thomas glanced at Silver, who simply blinked and stood still. Ranger sat by Thomas's boot. He nodded. The shutter clicked once, twice. Emma's expression softened. "You've done something beautiful here, sir." Thomas gave a humble shrug. "Didn't do much, just didn't walk away when it got hard." A crowd had begun to gather, now small town quiet, respectful, but undeniably curious. Among them, a little girl in a navy coat and red mittens pushed forward, her braids bouncing. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her cheeks were flushed and her front teeth missing. She approached Silver slowly, stopping just before his front hooves. Her voice was a whisper. "He was born again, wasn't he?" Thomas bent slightly, looking the girl in the eyes. "Who told you that?" "No one," she said. "But you can see it." She reached out, not to touch, but just to be close. Silver lowered his head toward her, and they stood like that, a child and a horse, breathing the same autumn air, sharing something wordless. Thomas's chest tightened. A woman stepped up behind the girl, tall, African-American, in her 40s, with soft eyes and a knit hat. Her name was Dana, a nurse at the county clinic, known for her steady hands and a voice that calmed even the crankiest patients. "I hope it's all right," she said. She read about the horse in the bulletin. "We thought it was just a story." "It was," Thomas replied, "until it wasn't." The town mayor, an elderly man named Russell Briggs, with suspenders that had seen more years than most buildings on Main Street, approached the small circle. His voice carried weight, but no pomp. "Well, Thomas, seems you brought more than just yourself this year." Thomas gave a quiet smile. "Guess we had a few things worth showing up for." By the time the fair reached its height, music playing, pies being judged, and ribbons handed out, Silver had become something of a silent guest of honor. Children gathered near the barn corner where he stood, watching from a respectful distance. Ranger basked in the attention, tail wagging modestly as folks bent to scratch his ears and thank him like a decorated war hero. Caroline arrived later, in a soft olive coat and dark jeans, hair loose for once. She walked up with 2 coffees and handed one to Thomas without a word. He took it, sipped, then said, "Thought you'd show." "Wouldn't miss it," she said. "Besides, I figured someone had to make sure you didn't say anything too grumpy." They stood in silence, watching the trio they'd helped build, a man, a dog, and a Mustang, surrounded by community, laughter, and second chances. "I'm glad you didn't give up on him," Caroline said softly. Thomas glanced sideways. "Truth is, I think I was the one being saved." Caroline's eyes met his, but she didn't reply. She didn't have to. As the sun began to set, painting the fair in soft orange light, Thomas found himself sitting on a bench near the square, a plaid blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Ranger lay at his feet. Silver stood behind them both, grazing quietly in the patch of lawn offered up just for him. Nearby, kids danced to the beat of a folk band playing fiddle and banjo. The scent of cinnamon and cider hung in the air. Thomas closed his eyes and let it all wash over him. He had thought the world had moved on without him, that there was nothing left but the ache of what was gone. But here, under the burnished gold of a Montana sunset, surrounded by new roots growing quietly beneath his feet, he knew better. He was still part of it. They all were. Silver had been born again. But so had he, and so had Ranger. The biggest lesson this story leaves behind is simple but true. Sometimes, the deepest healing comes not from fixing, but from simply staying. In a world that often rushes past pain, loyalty, patience, and quiet companionship can bring someone or something back to life. Whether you're carrying your own scars or walking beside someone who is, remember that presence matters more than perfection. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And just curious, if you had to name one moment that helped you heal in life, what would it be? Tell us in the comments below.